Good evening, everybody. Fabulous. It's great to be back. We seem to be a little bit depleted this evening. I think there are a couple of groups that are having difficulty logging on, but we'll plough on regardless. So I'm assuming that the people that we can't see may well be Dinsdale. So we're going to wave in the hope that Dinsdale is there and waving back. Thank you, Dinsdale. Fantastic. I think Tokoroa are yet to log on. Dinsdale, you may want to mute your microphone, possibly, if possible. Oh, yes. Anyway, right, you're working on that. Fabulous. Tokoroa are yet to log on. Waihi, I don't see Waihi either, so hopefully they will join us soon. Don't see Hawara either. New Plymouth, I see New Plymouth. Good evening, New Plymouth. Great to see you. Morrinsville, do we have Morrinsville? Yes. Hello, Morrinsville. Oh, and whoever the hand is, that's great. And Taumaranui, I can see Taumaranui there. So, good evening. Great to see you all. And as always, good evening and hello to the groups that are doing LiFT offline, Hamilton Cathedral, in New Plymouth, Raglan, Te Kuiti, Kawhia, Hawara and Te Aroha, and anybody else who's logging in. It's great to be back amongst you. I realised when I went on leave that I really landed Stephen in it, in the sense that it happened to coincide with two of probably the biggest weeks, I guess, that we've covered in LiFT. So well done everybody for sticking with that, and I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. And thanks indeed to Stephen for holding the fort. So the last 2 weeks, obviously, you've covered quite a lot of doctrine stuff, and I guess part of the thinking behind really immersing you in that, a lot of material, was just to give you a sort of a real thorough sense of some of the foundations for our faith. So if at any point you were feeling somewhat overwhelmed, don't be. But equally, actually, probably most of the time, all of us feel a little bit overwhelmed by one thing or another. And there's so much by way of richness and history and tradition that underpins aspects of our Christian faith that it's quite good just to have a sense of what that is. So you've covered obviously a lot of material in the last 2 weeks, and tonight we're going to be spending time thinking about the sacraments. So it's a slightly more focused evening tonight, which is a good thing. But let's start, as we always do, just by giving you an opportunity in your groups to look back at last week, and whether there's anything that has emerged from your reading or your thinking about last week's topics that you want to share about in your groups. So if you can do that for the next 10 minutes or so, I will be back with you. Everybody, let's dive into the pools of baptism. Try to make a link there between tonight's topic. So, what is a sacrament? That's a really good question. Sacrament is, I guess, a word that we don't use so much today in common language. You might do, of course, never rule that out, but it's certainly not a word that I use if I'm talking to people a lot during the day. I don't think I've said it once today, for example, in any of the conversations I've had. So it's a word that's pretty much reserved for particular rites, I suppose. That's R-I-T-E-S. And it's a word that has quite heavy religious overtones. And in some ways, actually, I think it's possibly a word that we would associate more so perhaps with the Roman Catholic Church than with other denominations. Which is an interesting point, because as we'll see in a moment, there are some differences between Anglican, Protestant understanding of sacraments and Roman Catholic understanding of sacraments. But it's an important word nonetheless, and I think it's helpful for us to have an understanding of what the sacraments are and what they're about, because they are foundational, in that baptism and the Eucharist are two things that we interact with regularly, particularly Eucharist. You know, all of us, I expect, have been baptised, and all of us encounter regularly the Eucharist. And so, in a sense, we're actually immersed in the life of the sacraments. And it's an important aspect of Anglicanism that the Eucharist is something that grounds our sense of encounter with God in a sort of really tangible way. You know, we partake of bread and wine. And in fact, the thing about the Eucharist is that it's something that's meant to evoke all the senses, you know, taste, touch, smell, sound. It's a completely multi-sensory experience. And I wonder sometimes if we forget that. It's very easy to domesticate things and make them quite tame and quite ordinary, when actually the whole point of the sacraments is that they're meant to reconnect us with the deepest sense of God as mystery. So that's why I think they're important. And indeed, if you ask somebody, or if they asked you what is a sacrament, you would probably begin your answer by saying baptism or the Eucharist, and you might talk about what they mean. But still, that's the danger with that, is that it's an in-house conversation. I think this is part of the tension that we find with using that word and trying to understand sacraments, is that how do we connect with people who are not part of the life of the church, for example, and how do we help them to understand what sacrament is. So you could follow up like that by saying that sacrament is a kind of a sign or a rite or a ritual. It's something that's done that points to a deeper meaning. So baptism involves water. It involves splashing water on a person, quite often a baby, and that can sometimes be quite polite, shall we say, or it can be kind of quite immersive. Full immersion baptism in a river, for example, is a bit different from baptism in a teeny tiny font. But anyway, it's something that's done that points to a deeper meaning. So we baptise people in order to point to their renewed or their new identity in Jesus Christ. That's the whole point of that rite or ritual. And Ross Thompson, in his book The Sacraments, says that a definition might be: sacraments are Christian rites in the sense that they are repeated Christian actions that serve to enact or express Christian ideas. So that kind of echoes that comment that I just made. But it must be said that while all Christian sacraments are rites, not all rites are sacraments. Okay, and that's where we get a little bit of difference, I suppose, with Roman Catholicism. So in our Anglican understanding, there are just two sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. Roman Catholicism expands this to 7 sacraments: baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, reconciliation, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders or ordination. So we have all of those things in Anglicanism too, but we don't consider all of those things to be sacraments. We just go with baptism and Eucharist because those are the two things that are that we can say quite confidently are scriptural. The term sacrament itself, though, has a much broader meaning, and a meaning that goes way beyond the bounds of Christianity, in that it sort of is a word that broadly means mystery or mysteries. And in fact, Eastern churches today, Eastern Orthodox churches, don't talk about sacraments, they talk about mysteries. So that word mystery is important, so hang on to that word this evening. And indeed, in the 1662 prayer book, in the Order for Holy Communion, it is described as these holy mysteries, which I actually personally think is a wonderful phrase. There's a lot of beautiful poetic language in the 1662 prayer book that I myself really like, and I find that it opens up something that's not found in more modern language, and that's helpful. I find that kind of thing quite helpful myself. So these holy mysteries, and that word, that Greek word mysterion, actually comes from a word muio, which means to shut the mouth, literally. So the whole point of a mystery is that it kind of something that renders you speechless. Yeah, and we've probably all had those experiences in life where you've encountered something and you've been rendered speechless. Maybe you can think of something that you've seen or felt or experienced, maybe a view that you've seen, maybe when you've looked up at the night sky, it could be anything. You've been rendered speechless. And in fact, you'll often hear in general language, people will say, I was lost for words. And you see, these are points of connection, I think, thinking about how we can connect our faith to the lives of people generally. There are points of connection, because there are these moments of profound recognition and insight. And that's the glimpse, I think, that we get of God's work in our world, that we can all connect with. So, I encountered something and I was lost for words. You can say, that's a mystery, because you were lost for words. And obviously it's related to words like mystikos, that we get the word mystic and mystical from. And there's a bit of a tension, I suppose, in the New Testament, really, and maybe in our faith, between that sort of encounter with God that renders us speechless and the need also to proclaim, to tell the good news. So we must find perhaps a sense of balance, I suppose, between waiting on God and experiencing the depths of God, that mystery, but at the same time telling the story. Yeah, so both are kind of important. Both are, it's a bit like Ecclesiastes, isn't it? There's adapting. There's a time to be silent, and there's a time to speak. It's not all about words. It's also about encountering the mystery. And I find time and time again, talking to people who are not formally part of the church, for example, who perhaps like here in Hamilton to climb the hill and go into the cathedral, that they do that because they go into that space and they recognise something that they cannot voice in words. And that's a really profound thing. So that's the mystery. If you have a look at Psalm 19, you get that wonderful evocation of proclamation. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. So that's a kind of representation, I suppose, of that tension between proclamation and silence, a time to speak and a time to wait on God and to wait on the mystery. If we look at the biblical witness to try and help us understand a little bit more about what some of the background to understanding sacraments is, there's a great Hebrew word which is probably pronounced something like raps. That Z sound is a kind of TS sound. But it's used a lot in the apocalyptic books, particularly to to talk about things that are quite obscure or dreamlike. And you get it a few times, particularly in the book of Daniel, which we've encountered a few times on LiFT. And it means something that's hidden. And there's a sense of, I guess, deliberate hiddenness often in the scriptural witness, that things are kept back from us, that it's not all revealed to us. And we get that word, I guess, transliterated, or a parallel word, which is this word mysterion, which we do find in the Gospels. And we often find it in the points of the Gospels where Jesus is talking in parables and things don't quite completely make sense. That's part of the trick, if you like, and I mean trick in a positive way, of the parables, that they're meant to make you stop and think about what the deeper meaning might be. And the word mysterion also occurs quite often in the letters of Paul, and there are some references there on page 27. So what I'd like you to do now in your groups is to take a look at one or two, or all if you can, of these references, and try and think who or what is the mystery. What is being described here that is a mystery, and what is its relation to time, and what other ideas can you find that these passages are related to? And you've got some space to make some notes there below. So let's take about 10 minutes or so just to spend a bit of time with one or two of those passages, and how that helps us understand this word mysterion. So I shall be back with you shortly. I hope you've sorted that out. We had a pretty lively discussion here, which got very philosophical, which was great. That's how I'm describing it, but that's good. Right, so Alistair McGrath talks about there being four essential components to what a sacrament is. So it has to involve some kind of physical or material element, like water, bread, wine, or oil. It has to have a likeness to the thing that it signifies, so that it can represent that thing. So you say that wine can have a likeness to the blood of Christ, for example. It has to have an authorization to signify the thing in question, so the words of Jesus instituting the Last Supper, for example. And it has to have this word that is efficacy. That's a good word. Again, we don't use a lot of these words in common speech, do we? So maybe your challenge for this week is to try and pop that word efficacy into your into your conversations with somebody. But anyway, that means that it's the thing. It's the way in which the sacrament is capable of conferring the benefits which it signifies to those who partake in it. Okay, so baptism, the efficacy of baptism is that it confers what we understand baptism to be about to the person that's being baptised. They are made into a child of God, part of the family of God. So it has to have a kind of way of, I guess, doing that. And that's both, I guess, visually, in that we see that water is involved, but also it involves this word mystery, because we know that there's something going on that we can't see, but God is at work in it. Kind of also involves grace, actually. That's another important word. An 11th century theologian by the name of Peter Lombard defines sacrament like this, and his definition has actually become quite important in shaping our understanding of sacrament. So even though it's quite an old definition, it underpins how we think of sacraments today. He says that a sacrament bears a likeness to the thing of which it is a sign. For if sacraments did not have a likeness of the things whose sacraments they are, they would not properly be called sacraments. Something can properly be called a sacrament if it is a sign of the grace of God and a form of invisible grace, so that it bears its image and exists as its cause. Sacraments were therefore instituted for the sake of sanctifying as well as of signifying. Those things which were instituted for the purpose of signifying alone are nothing more than signs and are not sacraments, as in the case of the physical sacrifices and ceremonial observances of the old law, which were never able to make those who offered them righteous. So what he's doing then is he's trying to make some distinction between the particularities of what we understand sacraments are, particularly baptism and Eucharist, and trying to make some distinction between that and all sorts of other rites and rituals and observations that we see in the scriptural witness. So it's about a focusing, I guess, in on things like baptism and the Eucharist, which is, as was pointed out here in Charlotte Brown House, kind of the point of the Reformation. You know, that was about getting back to basics, I suppose, getting back to the things that are scriptural, that matter. And at that point, that's what marks us as distinct from Roman Catholicism, particularly when it comes to understanding the sacraments, because we pared it back, I suppose, to that which we knew and understood to be scriptural: baptism, Eucharist. So let's spend a wee bit of time on baptism and Eucharist. So baptism, I guess, is the key. It's one of the key things of what it means to become a Christian. It expresses identity and commitment, and a taking on of Christ in our lives. So here's a quote, quite a lengthy quote from Rowan Williams that might help our understanding. It's quite a good one, this. He says, "We begin with baptism with the fact that people are formally brought into the Christian community by being dipped in water or having water poured over them. The word baptism originally just meant dipping. So Nick King, in his translation of the New Testament, calls John the Baptist John the Dipper. So next time you hear reference to John the Baptist, I challenge you to say, don't you mean John the Dipper? John the Big Dipper, yes. So anyway, that's what the word means dipping. If we turn to the New Testament, we find this word featuring in the ministry and teaching of Jesus, and also quite extensively in St. Paul's letters. Jesus speaks of the suffering and death that lies ahead of him as a baptism he is going to endure. That should be, not ensure. From the very beginning, baptism as a ritual for joining the Christian community was associated with the idea of going down into the darkness of Jesus' suffering and death. We are, so to speak, dropped into that mysterious event which Christians commemorate on Good Friday, and more regularly in the breaking of bread at Holy Communion. I am inclined to add that you might also expect the baptised Christian to be somewhere near, somewhere in touch with the chaos in his or her own life, because we all of us live not just with a chaos outside ourselves, but with quite a lot of inhumanity and muddle inside us. A baptised Christian ought to be somebody who is not afraid of looking with honesty at that chaos inside, as well as being where humanity is at risk outside. Now, there's a lot in that quote, but there's some really important things that we might not necessarily understand or associate with baptism, because I don't know about you, but I often just think of baptism as that thing that happened to me when I was very small and I don't remember it, but I know that I'm baptised. It's not necessarily the thing that makes me connect, for example, with Good Friday. But here in this quote from Rowan Williams, he makes that connection between the journey that Jesus was on in the whole of his life, which included suffering and death, which he describes as being a baptism, and taking that on board in terms of how we live our lives and how we, I suppose, at times wrestle inside and out with who we are and how we are as Christians. And all of that's kind of bound up in what it means to be baptised. And I find that quite challenging, but also quite encouraging, and certainly it reminds me of how it's important to connect with baptism. Really the correct place to have a font in a church is by the door. So if you, in your church, think about where your font is, if it's not by the door, move it. You might need a faculty for that, but that's okay. But the correct place to put a font is by the door, because every time we enter and leave a church, we should reconnect with our baptism. And we do that week in and week out, because we know that between one Sunday and the next, or whenever we are coming to church for a service, there's a lot of stuff going on, not just in our lives, but in the whole world. There's an awful lot of stuff happening in the world. And a lot of that is messy and chaotic. And all of that's bound up in the understanding of what baptism is as a sacrament. And I think that's a really powerful thing. So we won't do this now because we need to move on, but just reflect on that during the week, I guess. Is that a helpful thing, actually, for us to think about baptism in that way, that it's not a once and for all thing that happens to us. It's something that we can reconnect with constantly. And that's why baptism and the way baptism happens with water, etc., is quite a powerful symbol. And anthropologist Mary Douglas talks about natural symbols like water as being really powerful in representing things like cleansing, life and death. You know, water's a really powerful thing. It reminds us of all sorts of points in our life, of life, of death, of cleansing. And if you look at the richness of the tradition of how water is described and used in the scriptural witness, you'll see a lot of that deep symbolism. For Paul, for example, Apostle Paul, baptism is really importantly participation in the death and resurrection of Jesus, bringing new creation. It joins us to the body of Christ, a universal new humanity in which all share equally regardless of race, gender or status. It's a putting on of Christ. That's quite a powerful thing. The book of Acts refers several times to baptism of whole households together, which would probably refer to, the household would have included people of all ages, children, slaves, all that sort of thing. And often it's those references that are used to support the witness of infant baptism. Bit of a debate, of course, in the Christian church about infant or adult baptism. But certainly we can see from Acts that whole households were baptised, which must have included infants. And certainly by the year 200, children were being baptised. But there is a bit of a debate around that, which you may wish to touch base on briefly. In fact, let's do that. Let's have a quick local group debate on infant baptism. How about that? See if you can solve that one in a few minutes. Probably you won't be able to, but it's good to stop and think about who's being baptised and what we think about that. Okay, I'll be back with you in a few minutes. Right, I hope you've all resolved that centuries-old great debate about infant baptism. If you have, well done. We certainly achieved something here by way of diplomacy in Hamilton. Right, so Rowan Williams, I'm just going to finish baptism with this quote from Rowan Williams because I think it's quite cool. He says that baptism is a gift because in this community of baptised people we receive life from others' prayer and love, and we give the prayer and love that others need. We are caught up in a great economy of giving and exchange. The solidarity that baptism brings us into, the solidarity with suffering, is the solidarity with one another as well. It is what some Christian writers have called, in a rather forbidding word, co-inherence. There's another word that you want to put into your conversations during this week. We've got efficacy, and now you can have a go at co-inherence. We are implicated in one another. Isn't that fantastic? We are implicated in one another. Our lives are interwoven. What affects one Christian affects all. What affects all affects one. That's really powerful stuff. And that's part of what this word efficacy, if you like, of baptism is about. It means that we are all implicated in one another's lives. Yeah, so it's not about me, the kind of the all about me stuff. It's all about us and how we are implicated in one another's lives because we have this common inheritance of baptism. That's really powerful. Right, we've done baptism, so let's move on to the Eucharist. Again, another good quote from Rowan Williams. He says that for Christians to share in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, means to live as people who know that they are always guests, that they have been welcomed and that they are wanted. It is perhaps the most simple thing that we can say about Holy Communion, yet it is still supremely worth saying. In Holy Communion, Jesus Christ tells us that he wants our company. Again, that's a really powerful image, symbol, that idea that when we share in the Eucharist together, it is Christ that wants our company, that desires to be with us. Like baptism, the Eucharist uses various symbols that have a lot of meaning. The idea of the meal, so the eating together, means that we share in life together. The Passover, the importance of that part of the scriptural narrative. And the idea of covenant, a new relationship between God and humanity. And Alistair McGrath, the theologian, talks about elements of what the Eucharist is about. It's a recollection, a looking backward. So we look back at not just the event of Jesus' death, but all of the scriptural narrative that led up to that point. It's an anticipation, so we're looking forward. So the idea of the great heavenly banquet that's talked about in Revelation that we look forward to. This wonderfully named Theodore of Mopsuestia. Fantastic names some of these early church fathers had. They don't make them like that these days. I don't know any Theodores myself, certainly not ones that are... Really?
Yes.
Right, we've got a Theodore here in Charlotte Brown House. Fantastic. But is he of Mopsuestia?
No, he's of Holland.
He's of Holland. Fair enough. That's good too. Anyway, Theodore of Mopsuestia wrote this: every time that the liturgy of this awesome sacrifice is performed, which is the clear image of the heavenly realities, we should imagine that we are in heaven. Faith enables us to picture in our minds those heavenly realities as we remind ourselves that the same Christ who is now in heaven is also present under these symbols. So when faith enables our eyes to contemplate what now takes place, we are brought again to see his death, resurrection and ascension, which have already taken place for our sakes. Okay, so in your average celebration of the Eucharist in your church, do you feel like you are being bound up in heaven? Yes, no? It's a reminder that liturgy is really important. Okay, so if you have a priest kind of going, the Lord be with you, that's not really going to invoke the image of heaven, is it? Which is why when I was involved a lot in training priests, I said for them, for goodness sake, when you're presiding at the Eucharist, kind of look like something interesting and important is happening, not that you're just reading the weather report in the newspaper or whatever, because we've got this fantastic quote from Theodore of Mopsuestia that says, every time that the liturgy of this awesome sacrifice is performed, we should imagine that we are in heaven. Okay? Really important. That's why liturgy really matters, and liturgy done well is a good thing. So this idea of looking backwards and looking forward kind of implies the whole drama of that sacrament of the Eucharist. Again, it's about delving into the mystery of God's dealings with us, past, present, future. Now, if you turn over the page onto page 32, at the bottom of that page you'll see this little chart of a kind of wave, and it's one, I guess, reflection on how the liturgy of the Eucharist works. So remember, when we talk about the sacrament of the Eucharist and the liturgy of the Eucharist, they're kind of related. Okay, so we talk about the sacrament of the Eucharist as that which uses the symbols, bread, wine, but actually the whole liturgy is the sacrament of the Eucharist. The whole service matters, and this little kind of wavy thing at the bottom of page 32 kind of gives a sense of where the high points and the low points are. You'll probably notice that the sermon is kind of down there in the dip. The sermon's important too. It needs to be seen in the context of what we're actually building up to, and that is the words of institution. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes now, no more than that, in your local groups to kind of think about that picture. Because I imagine for some of you, you'll be thinking, oh, hang on a minute, the sermon's really important. And we do have this tension in our Protestant and Catholicness, that we value the preaching and the word, and, it's word and sacrament, but actually they're both bound up together. So just have a couple of minutes to reflect on that wavy picture at the bottom of page 32, and I'll be back with you shortly. Hey, look, I won't read this now because we're near the end, but another really good quote from Rowan Williams there, page 33, that it's worth spending a bit of time on. Again, one of the wonderful things about a lot of Rowan Williams's quotes and thinking is that he constantly encourages us to look at the bigger picture. So what is the relationship between that sacrament and the wider picture that we are involved in ourselves? And that's a really powerful quote from him. So spend some time perhaps this week thinking about the ways in which both baptism and Eucharist place us in a particular context, but at the same time help us to remember that we are, this word, implicated in one another's lives. And obviously the thing about the structure of the Eucharist as well is that we're implicated in the lives of Christians all over the world that are sharing in that Eucharistic celebration week in, week out, in the same way that we are. And that's a really powerful thing, particularly in parts of the world where Christians are persecuted or experiencing difficulty. And we are connected to them, both in our baptism, but also in our celebration of the Eucharist. We're not, unfortunately, because time is running out, we won't have time to do this in your local groups, but those of you who are doing it offline, you can have some fun with this, to think about what you might do in your local church context to engage really in understanding more deeply the symbols and the signs that are part of our understanding of our faith. Is there any, think about your church building, what there helps you understand what baptism and Eucharist are about? How do you encounter that? How might you help people that are not part of church to encounter the signs and the symbols and the understandings of what these sacraments are? And then finally, I think something to take away with you this week is this wonderful quote from Martin Rowe. It's quoted in the really good book by Dave Tomlinson called The Bad Christian's Manifesto, which sort of sounds like a contradiction, but it's a fantastic book because it's couched in such down-to-earth, grounded language that you read it and you think, oh, yeah, okay. It's okay. It's okay to not entirely understand things all the time, and maybe we need that at the end of 3 weeks' worth of heavy doctrine, but it's okay. But he talks about in this poem just the idea of the word sacrament as being applied to elements of our daily life, and I think that's a really powerful thing too, that even though formally as the church we see baptism and Eucharist as sacraments, actually there's an importance of understanding aspects of our everyday lives as being sacraments. So the sacrament of a joke, the sacrament of tears in your eyes, the sacrament of a meal slowly cooking, the sacrament of a round glass of wine, the sacrament of a child's first wide-eyed steps, the sacrament of all that trust in you, the sacrament of bass, drum, guitar, the sacrament connected to the hip bone, that wonderful song goes, the sacrament of being there, right place, right time, the sacrament of a listening ear, the sacrament of the novel you can't put down, the sacrament of the poem with no rhyme, the sacrament of starlings and V formation, the sacrament of eye contact with a dog, the sacrament of questions with no answers, the sacrament of silence, enough said, the sacrament of a life baptized by love, the sacrament of the divine in bread and wine. Thanks everybody for your attention tonight. Next week we're going to think about Christian vision and discipleship. So next week's the final session of this block. And if you could please, I'd be really grateful if you were able to have a look at these couple of YouTube videos if you can. I mentioned on page 35 from Peter O'Connor. If you can't look at them, don't worry, you're not going to miss a huge deal, but it would be helpful if at least a few of you in your place could have a look at those videos, as they will inform something of our thinking about vision and discipleship next week. So thanks everybody, have a great week, and I look forward to being with you all again next week. So good evening to Dinsdale. Have a great week everybody. It's goodbye from Hamilton. Hello and goodbye to Tokoroa. It's great to see you there, joined us. Fantastic that you all managed to log in. That's great to see you. Have a brilliant week. Not sure that Waihi has made it, but hopefully they might connect with it during the week. Good evening, goodbye to New Plymouth. Great to see you all again. And good evening, goodbye to Morrinsville. Fantastic to see you all. And yeah, brilliant. Oh, great. Good to see the other side of the room. Hi, everybody. And good evening and goodbye to Taumaranui. Have a great week, everybody, and goodbye as well to all of those doing LiFT offline during the week. See you next time. Bye-bye.